Well, it's with great pleasure now that I'd like to introduce you to our afternoon's keynote presentation, BPD, Better Practice Deserved. The woman I'm about to introduce you to will be familiar to quite a few people in the room, and she's worth knowing if you haven't heard about her already, if it is a new introduction to you. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Peggy Brown. And Dr. Brown is a consultant psychiatrist who has had clinical and administrative positions in psychiatry in Queensland, the Australian Capital Territory, Northern Territory and in the United Kingdom. She's also previously held the roles of Director General at the ACT Health and CEO of the National Mental Health Commission. Currently she works part-time at Metro South Addictions and Mental Health Service in Brisbane, and serves as a Senior Clinical Advisor to the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare on the project relating to digital mental health services. Peggy's also a member of the Agency Management Committee of the Australian Health Practitioners Regulatory Agency and a member of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. A Senior Clinical Advisor for the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, and a former CEO of the National Mental Health Commission. She's also a big friend to those of us with lived experience and has made herself very, very available over the years to be a friend for lived experience. So can I get you to warmly welcome Dr. Peggy Brown?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for that very warm introduction. Can I just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge everyone in the room today with lived experience of any mental health issues, particularly those with lived experience of BPD. Now I'm going to commence with a confession. I don't always do this, but I have done it a couple of times recently. I actually prepared a presentation to deliver to you this afternoon. I am kind of wicked in as much as I never get my presentations to the organisers a week ahead as they ask. I always rely on getting it done at the last minute, and unfortunately this morning when I got up to print out my presentation just in case, the whole file was corrupted. So you're not going to get to see the pretty pictures and slides that I did actually prepare for you, but I have sat in the car and scribbled out my presentation to you, so you're going to have to forgive me. I wanted to talk to you about BPD, and I titled my talk, Better Practice Deserved. But you're going to hear those initials, BPD, a few times as I speak. Now, I don't pretend in any way to be an expert around BPD. Most of my career over the last couple of decades has focused more on policy and systems and change and reform in mental health and across health. And I certainly think when we're talking about policy and systems around BPD, we're talking about an area that does need change and reform. And I think if I was to ask colleagues in the sector how they would describe, I guess, BPD, not necessarily BPD, the disorder, but what words come to mind under the initials of B and P and D when they think about BPD and the service system. And I don't in any way say this with any sense of wanting to add to the stigma that I know exists, but I think it probably is a reflection of the responses I would get. I haven't actually conducted this little test, but I think the B, they would say boundaries and battles and baggage and blame and maybe bad behaviour and I guess brief interactions. And I think the P might stand for permanent or persistent, certainly prevalent, perplexing, a lot of pain, pessimism, and certainly pejorative comments. And I think the D might stand for difficult and distress, maybe even despair, distrust, disapproval, damage, dismissed, and for the insightful, maybe even discrimination. And so, as I say, I don't say that to try and add to the stigma, but I think it's probably a reflection of the sentiments that do exist in much of the sector when you talk about BPD, even in 2018. I think that paints a picture of a challenging scenario. And so you'd think, when you're in a health system, a relatively well-resourced health system, and you're talking about challenging scenarios, well, obviously we would throw a lot of resources towards it. Is that right? No. BPD, what do we get? And pardon my language, a bloody poor deal. Why do I say that? And look, I put my hands up. I've been a director of mental health. I've been a director general. I'm responsible as much as anyone else out there for what's gone before. But I still stand here and say to you, I think it's been a bloody poor deal. Why? Because the services still aren't there when they're required. Sometimes they're not there at all, particularly if you live outside capital cities. The services are difficult to access, they're mostly orientated towards responding just to crisis. The treatment services aren't as readily available as they should be. And the staff will say to you, I don't have the skills, I don't have the training. And certainly I think at a systems level, it's not prioritised in terms of policy or funding or service planning. Why is that? Well, BPD. I think because people discriminate. Consciously or unconsciously, I think we have to accept there is an element of discrimination that leads not only to the attitudes and behaviours that are experienced, but also in terms of some of those decisions that get made in the system around the policies, around the funding, etc. So I would say BPD, but please don't. Stigma and discrimination do a lot of damage. They cause a lot of distress. They add to the distress that's already there as a result of the disorder. And I would ask, my colleagues, what if this was your son or your daughter? Would you be responding the same way? So BPD, please don't, because it's patently dangerous. We get poor outcomes. BPD itself is challenging, but the absence of appropriate response leads to even worse outcomes. And more than that, it deters help seeking, delays anyone wanting to seek help until they're in crisis. Then the emergency services have to get involved. That complicates the whole dynamics. It exacerbates any previous history of trauma that may be there, adds to even worse outcomes, and that adds to the reluctance to seek help, and the whole cycle starts over again. The other BPD, please don't, because people die. BPD, as you know, is associated with a high level of morbidity and mortality. And that's mortality from suicide, extraordinarily high rates when you compare it to the general public, misadventure sometimes, And also physical health. Again, the same stigma and discrimination impacts on people who have physical health disorders. So the life expectancy of someone with BPD is significantly less than the general population. Now that's also the case for people with other severe mental illness, we know that, but that doesn't make it acceptable. That kind of paints a bit of a bleak picture, I know. So I'd like to flip the coin now and look for the positives. I have a BPD, a big picture dream. I think we can make a difference. I think that we can make a difference by training and education for our health professionals, by looking at how we organise our services so that we have both generalised services and then the more specialised services and make them more readily available. I think we need to look at the services in the psychosocial support area, in the housing and education support area. I think we can make a difference in terms of investing more in research as well and in supporting people with BPD and their carers and loved ones. What do we need to get there? BPD. We need some big, bold policy decisions. We need to recognise that for a disorder that's as prevalent as BPD is, that has the high levels of morbidity and mortality, and in fact high human, social and economic costs, that we really need to have the policymakers and the politicians sit up and take notice. They need to prioritise decisions about funding and service planning for people with BPD. And I think if we do that, we can get to the BPD on the screen, which is better practice. There's absolutely no question, and I'm sure Bryn's told you today, there are evidence-based treatments there if only we could make them readily available. We have to organise the service system to be able to make that available to those living with BPD. So better practice is what I think is required. It can be achieved, and it's certainly deserved for this cohort of people who have not been served well by our system for many, many years, if ever. So my final BPD, if I go back to my original experiment and say, what does BPD stand for? In my big picture dream, B stands for things like bright and better and balanced and new beginnings and believing and belonging and brave and bold. And P stands for positive and possible and participation and permission and practical and pride and progress. And D stands for different and daring and decisive and delivered and distinguished and delightful. Thank you.